Minji Park slipped through the heavy wooden doors of Seoul Conservatory's East Practice Hall, her footsteps echoing in the nearly empty corridor. It was barely 7 a.m. Most students wouldn't arrive for another 2 hours, which was exactly why she came so early. The fewer people who heard her play, the better. The morning sunlight filtered through tall windows, casting long shadows across the polished floor. Minji clutched her worn leather music bag closer to her chest. Inside was her small collection of treasures: dog-eared sheet music passed down from her grandmother, a faded photograph of her family standing beside their old upright piano, and a lucky jade pendant her mother had given her when she first started playing at age 5, 3 weeks into her first semester, and Minji still felt like an imposter. The Seoul Conservatory of Music accepted only 30 piano students each year from thousands of applicants. Some had been performing since they were toddlers, winning international competitions and playing with orchestras around the world. Then there was Minji, who hadn't performed in public for nearly 8 years. "You're hiding again," she whispered to herself, finding practice room number 12, the one with the slightly out-of-tune Yamaha that nobody wanted. She preferred it that way. The small imperfections in its middle C and the sticky pedal made other students avoid it. For Minji, those flaws were comforting, like a friend with quirks rather than the intimidating perfection of the concert grands in the main hall. Minji set her bag down and pulled out her student ID to swipe into the room. The little screen flashed green, and she quickly shut the door behind her. She took a deep breath, inhaling the familiar scent of wood polish and paper. This small room with its soundproofed walls was the only place she felt safe at the conservatory. She hadn't wanted to come here. When her father's company transferred him to Seoul from their small coastal town, Minji had planned to attend a regular university and study literature. Music was something she did for herself, alone in her bedroom with headphones on so nobody could hear. But her high school music teacher had other ideas. Without telling Minji, he had submitted a recording of her playing, one he'd made during a practice session when she didn't know he was listening. "You can't hide this kind of talent forever," he'd told her when presenting the acceptance letter. Her parents had been overjoyed, seeing only the prestige of the school, not understanding the terror it awakened in their daughter. Minji sat down at the piano bench and ran her fingers lightly over the keys without pressing them. She closed her eyes, remembering the last time she had performed in public. She had been 11 years old, a so-called prodigy set to play Mozart's Piano Concerto No. 23 with a youth orchestra. She had practiced for months, played it perfectly hundreds of times in rehearsal. Then she walked on stage, saw the audience, all those eyes watching, judging, waiting, and something broke inside her. Her hands had trembled so badly she could barely hit the keys. Notes she'd played effortlessly since she was 7 suddenly became impossible puzzles. She'd stopped halfway through, tears streaming down her face, and ran off stage. The shame of that moment had never left her. Minji opened her eyes and pulled out her class assignment, a relatively simple Chopin nocturne that Professor Lee had assigned to all first-year students. She began to play, deliberately making small mistakes, playing just well enough to earn average marks. It was a delicate balance, not good enough to attract attention, not bad enough to get kicked out. The door suddenly opened and Minji jumped, her fingers crashing down on the wrong keys. "Sorry." A girl with round glasses and a messy ponytail peeked in. "I thought this room was empty." She tilted her head, listening to the lingering notes. "Are you working on the Chopin assignment too?" Minji nodded, closing her music book. "I'm Jinna, 2nd year." The girl stepped inside without waiting for an invitation. "You're new, right?" "I've seen you around." "Minji," she replied quietly. "1st year." Jinna leaned against the wall. "You always practice this early?" "It's quieter," Jinna laughed. "Most people come here to be heard, you know." Minji didn't respond, hoping the girl would leave. Instead, Jinna walked over to the piano and peered at the music. "Play it again." "I'm stuck on the middle section." Minji's stomach tightened. Even with just one person listening, her hands grew cold and stiff. She forced herself to breathe and played the nocturne again, deliberately fumbling the difficult runs, simplifying the dynamics. Jinna frowned. "That's interesting interpretation," she said diplomatically. "Have you met Professor Kang yet?" Minji shook her head. Professor Kang taught the advanced students. His reputation preceded him, brilliant, demanding, and merciless with students who didn't meet his standards. Half the student body worshipped him. The other half lived in fear of his cutting critiques. "Lucky you," Jenna said with feeling. "He's doing evaluations next week, though. All first years have to play for him." The room suddenly felt smaller. "What? That's not in the schedule." "It never is." Jenna's expression was sympathetic. "He springs it on the new students every year. Likes to see how you perform under pressure." Minji's heart pounded in her chest. She had specifically chosen classes with professors known for being more technical than performance-focused. She'd carefully read every syllabus, confirmed every requirement. Nowhere had an evaluation with Professor Kang been mentioned. "Don't look so scared," Jenna said, misreading Minji's panic as normal nervousness. "He mostly wants to see your potential, not perfection." She glanced at her watch. "I've got to run to theory class." "Nice meeting you." After Jenna left, Minji sat frozen on the bench. She thought of the voice memo still saved on her phone, the one her father had accidentally recorded last month when she didn't know anyone was home. She'd been playing Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 3, losing herself in its complexity, the way she only could when completely alone. That was beautiful. "Minji, her father had said afterward, his voice thick with emotion. "Why don't you ever play like that for others?" Minji hadn't answered him. How could she explain that the music lived inside her differently when nobody was listening? That the notes flowed freely from her fingers only when there were no eyes watching, no ears judging, no expectations to fulfill? Now, in the small practice room, Minji opened her bag again and pulled out the sheet music she kept hidden beneath her assignments. The Rachmaninoff Concerto, pages worn from years of secret practice. Her fingers hovered over the keys. She needed to prepare for this unexpected evaluation, but playing the assigned pieces well enough to pass while not well enough to stand out would require more control than usual. The conservatory began to wake up around her. She could hear footsteps in the hallway, doors opening and closing, distant scales and arpeggios as other students warmed up. Soon the building would be humming with music from every room, violins soaring, cellos moaning, flutes trilling, and dozens of pianos carrying melodies and harmonies that blended into a chaotic symphony. Minji gathered her courage and began to play the Chopin properly, the way she would if she were alone in her room. The notes flowed from her fingers like water, each phrase shaped with instinctive musicality. She would practice playing just well enough, finding that perfect balance of competence and mediocrity that would keep her safely invisible. But as she played, a familiar figure paused outside her door listening. Professor Kang, already making his morning rounds, heard something in the seemingly average students playing that caught his attention. Not perfection, but possibility. The hesitation in certain passages wasn't from lack of skill, but from something else entirely. He made a mental note of the room number before continuing down the hall. Minji finished the piece and sighed. 1 week until the evaluation. 7 days to prepare herself to be average in front of the most demanding professor at the conservatory. She closed the fallboard over the keys and rested her forehead against the cool wood. "You can do this," she whispered to herself. "Just don't stand out." She had no way of knowing that her carefully constructed anonymity was already beginning to crumble, or that in the coming days, everything she feared most would be thrust upon her, along with everything she secretly dreamed of but didn't dare admit, even to herself. The week leading up to Professor Kang's unexpected evaluation had been the longest of Minji's life. She'd practiced for hours each day, carefully calibrating her performance to be good but forgettable. Not too many mistakes, but enough hesitation to seem like an average student still finding her way. It was exhausting, this deliberate mediocrity. Friday evening arrived and most students had left campus to start their weekends. The halls of the Seoul Conservatory grew quiet as practice rooms emptied one by one. Minji had just finished her last class of the day, music theory with Professor Lee, who had kept them late discussing the intricacies of counterpoint. Rather than heading home, Minji found herself walking toward the main concert hall. The grand space would be empty now, locked for the weekend, but she knew the side door that maintenance sometimes left open when cleaning. She'd discovered it by accident during her second week, when she'd gotten lost trying to find the administration office. The concert hall was the heart of the conservatory, a magnificent room with soaring ceilings, rich wooden panels, and perfect acoustics. At its center stood a gleaming Steinway concert grand, the finest instrument Minji had ever seen. She'd never dared to play it, had only gazed at it from afar during required recitals. Tonight, something pulled her toward it. Perhaps it was the stress of the upcoming evaluation, or the weight of pretending to be less than she was. Whatever the reason, Minji found herself slipping through the side door into the darkened concert hall. Moonlight streamed through the high windows, casting the empty seats in a soft blue glow. The piano waited on the stage like a sleeping giant. Minji stood in the shadows for several minutes just listening to the silence, making sure she was truly alone. Slowly, she walked down the center aisle and climbed the steps to the stage. Her footsteps echoed in the empty space. The piano's lid was closed, its surface reflecting the moonlight. Minji ran her fingers along its edge, feeling the smooth, polished wood beneath her fingertips. She sat down on the bench and opened the lid. The keys gleamed white and black in the dim light, perfect and untouched. Minji placed her hands on the keys without pressing them, feeling their cool smoothness. She closed her eyes and took a deep breath. Then she began to play, not the Chopin she'd been practicing all week, not the simplified versions she performed in class. Instead, her fingers found the opening notes of Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 3, the piece she'd been secretly practicing for years, the one that lived in her hardened hands when no one was listening. The music filled the concert hall, bouncing off the walls and ceiling, surrounding her with sound. The Steinway responded to her touch like a living thing, each note crystal clear, each chord rich with overtones. Minji forgot about evaluations and professors. She forgot about staying hidden and being average. She forgot everything except the music flowing through her. The piece was notoriously difficult, a mountain that many professional pianists approached with caution. Its technical demands were extreme. Lightning-fast passages, huge hand stretches, complex rhythms, and delicate expressiveness all woven together. But Minji's fingers flew across the keys with natural ease, finding each note perfectly, shaping each phrase with intuitive musicality. As she reached the first movement's cadenza, a breathtaking solo passage of escalating difficulty, she leaned into the piano, her body swaying with the music. Her right hand crossed over her left, then back again, creating cascades of notes that tumbled through the concert hall like musical rain. Lost in the piece, Minji didn't notice the door at the back of the hall opening slightly. She didn't see Professor Kang enter, his face illuminated by the screen of his phone as he checked a message. She didn't see him freeze mid-step as the music washed over him, or watch as he slowly pocketed his phone and took a seat in the back row. Nor did she notice when Professor Lee and Professor Park, who had been working late in nearby offices, slipped in quietly and sat beside him, their faces showing identical expressions of wonder. Minji continued playing, pouring everything into the music, all her fears, her frustrations, her secret dreams. When she reached the final movement, her hands seemed to be moving of their own accord, finding impossible tempos and executing leaps across the keyboard that many pianists spent years perfecting. The sound swelled and receded like ocean waves, building to a triumphant conclusion that left echoes ringing through the concert hall. The final chord hung in the air, slowly fading into silence. Minji sat motionless, eyes still closed, breathing heavily. For a few precious seconds, she remained in that perfect space where nothing existed but the afterglow of music. Then she heard it, the sound of hands clapping. Minji's eyes flew open. The house lights had come on, though she hadn't noticed when. And there, in the third row, sat 3 professors, including Professor Kang himself. The blood drained from her face. Her hands began to shake. She stood up so quickly that the piano bench nearly toppled backward. "I'm sorry," she stammered. I shouldn't be here." The door was open and, "Sit down, Miss Park," Professor Kang said, his voice calm but commanding. Minji sank back onto the bench, her legs suddenly too weak to hold her. How did he know her name? She'd never even spoken to him before. The 3 professors made their way to the stage, climbing the steps with deliberate slowness. Professor Lee was smiling. Professor Park looked puzzled. Professor Kang's face was unreadable, his thick eyebrows drawn together in what might have been concentration or displeasure. "That was Rachmaninoff's third, was it not?" Professor Kang asked, though it clearly wasn't really a question. Minji nodded, unable to speak. "An interesting choice for a first-year student," he continued, "particularly one whose class assignments have been—" He glanced at Professor Lee, competent but unremarkable, Minji stared at her hands in her lap. Look at me. Miss Park. She raised her eyes to meet his. Professor Kang was in his 60s with salt and pepper hair and intense eyes behind round glasses. His reputation for brilliance was matched only by his reputation for being impossibly demanding. How long have you been playing the H3? Minji swallowed. 4 years, sir. 4 years. He exchanged glances with the other professors. And who taught you this piece? No one, sir. I learned it myself. Professor Park made a small sound of disbelief. That's impossible. This piece requires years of professional guidance. Minji said nothing. What could she say? That she'd found an old recording in her grandmother's things? That she'd listened to it obsessively until she could hear every note in her head? That she'd taught herself by playing along measure by measure until her fingers knew the way? Professor Kang studied her face. Your technique is unorthodox in places, he said finally. But effective. Remarkably so. Thank you, sir, Minji whispered. Don't thank me, he said sharply. Explain to me why a pianist of your caliber is deliberately underperforming in her classes. The directness of the question caught her off guard. She opened her mouth, then closed it again, searching for words that wouldn't come. Professor Lee stepped forward. Minji, I've had you in my class for 3 weeks. You've never played like this. Not even close. Minji looked down at the keyboard. I don't like people watching me play. You're attending a conservatory, Professor Kang said flatly. Performance is rather the point. I know, she said, her voice barely audible. Professor Park's expression softened. Are you experiencing performance anxiety? Minji nodded, grateful for the lifeline. Since I was 11. The professors exchanged glances again, some unspoken communication passing between them. We'll need to review your application materials, Professor Kang said finally. And your previous education records. He turned to leave, then paused. Miss Park, the evaluation scheduled for next week, you will play this piece. The complete concerto. Minji felt the blood drain from her face. Sir, I can't. You just did, he interrupted. You played it flawlessly in an empty hall in the dark without preparation. You will play it again, for the faculty panel, in 1 week, but this is not a request. Miss Park, it is a requirement. His voice was stern, but there was something else there too, a hint of what might have been excitement. Talent like yours will not remain hidden at my conservatory. With that, he turned and walked off the stage, followed by Professor Park. Only Professor Lee lingered. Minji, she said quietly, what happened to make you afraid of performing? Minji's throat tightened. The memory of her last public performance was still painful after all these years. I failed, she said simply. Everybody was watching and I just couldn't play anymore. Professor Lee nodded thoughtfully. And you've been hiding ever since. It wasn't a question. I can't do what Professor Kang is asking, Minji said, her voice breaking. I can't play in front of people. You played for us just now, Professor Lee pointed out. I didn't know you were there. Professor Lee smiled slightly. Then perhaps that's the key. She patted Minji's shoulder. Get some rest this weekend. And Minji, whatever happens next week, you have a gift. Don't be afraid of it. After Professor Lee left, Minji sat alone at the piano for a long time. The concert hall was silent again, but the air still seemed to vibrate with echoes of what had happened. Her secret was out. She closed the piano lid gently and stood up. As she walked off the stage, she felt something shift inside her, a tiny crack in the wall she'd built around herself and her music. She didn't know if it was fear or hope or something else entirely. All she knew was that in 7 days, she would have to face the thing that terrified her most, or lose everything she'd worked for. Minji barely slept all weekend. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Professor Kang's stern face, heard his commanding voice. Talent like yours cannot remain hidden at my conservatory. The words followed her like a shadow, even as she tried to lose herself in her usual weekend routine, helping her mother with housework, video calling her grandmother back in their hometown, reading books that had nothing to do with music. By Monday morning, dark circles had formed under her eyes. She considered skipping classes altogether, but knew that would only delay the inevitable. Professor Kang's reputation suggested he wasn't a man who forgot things or changed his mind. Minji arrived at the conservatory early as usual, hoping to slip into her practice room unnoticed. But as she crossed the main lobby, a voice called her name. Miss Park. She turned to see Professor Kang's assistant, a thin man with wire-rimmed glasses. The professor would like to see you in his office now. Minji clutched her bag tighter. I have class in 20 minutes. Professor Kang has already spoken with your instructors. This way, please. Heart hammering in her chest, Minji followed the assistant down a long corridor she'd never had reason to visit before. They passed practice rooms where early morning students were already hard at work, the sounds of various instruments blending into a discordant symphony. Finally, they reached a heavy wooden door with a simple brass nameplate, Professor Kang Woo-jin, Department Chair. The assistant knocked twice and opened the door without waiting for a response. Miss Park is here, Professor. Send her in. Minji stepped into the office, immediately struck by its unexpected warmth. Unlike the stark modernity of most of the conservatory, Professor Kang's office felt lived in. Bookshelves lined the walls, crammed with scores and texts. A small grand piano stood in one corner, its lid propped open. The morning sunlight streamed through large windows, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air. Professor Kang sat behind a desk covered with stacks of papers. To Minji's surprise, he wasn't alone. Professor Lee and Professor Park were also there, along with an older woman Minji didn't recognize. Sit down. Miss Park, Professor Kang said, gesturing to an empty chair facing the desk. Minji sat, placing her bag carefully at her feet. Her hands were trembling slightly, so she clasped them together in her lap. This is Dean Wong, Professor Kang said, nodding toward the older woman. She oversees all performance departments at the conservatory. The dean smiled kindly at Minji. I've heard a great deal about you in the last 48 hours. Miss Park. Minji didn't know how to respond to that, so she simply nodded. We've been reviewing your application, Professor Kang continued, lifting a folder from his desk. It's interesting reading. Minji's throat went dry. Sir? You indicated no previous performance experience, Professor Kang said. No competitions, no recitals, no notable achievements in music. That's correct, Minji said quietly. Professor Kang opened the folder. And yet, when we looked deeper into your background, we found something quite different. He pulled out a newspaper clipping and slid it across the desk. Minji didn't need to look at it. She knew what it was. A photo of 11-year-old Minji sitting at a piano much too large for her. Her name in the caption listing her as a featured soloist in a youth concert. You were considered something of a prodigy, Professor Kang said. You performed with the Regional Youth Orchestra from age 8. Won several junior competitions. Your former teacher, Mr. Cho, wrote quite glowingly about your potential. He paused, studying her face. And then at age 11 you stopped. Completely. No more performances, no more competitions. You switched to a different teacher who focused on technique rather than performance. Your school records show you refused to play in any school concerts despite your music teacher's recommendations. Minji stared at her hands. She could feel the eyes of all 4 faculty members on her, waiting for an explanation. What happened, Minji? Professor Lee asked gently. The memory rose up again. The hot lights, the sea of faces, the paralysis that had overtaken her fingers, the humiliation of running off stage in tears. 8 years later, and it still made her chest tighten. I had a bad experience, she said finally. I froze on stage. Couldn't play. Couldn't move. It was like my body just shut down. She swallowed hard. I've never been able to perform since then. A heavy silence filled the room. And yet, Professor Kang said, you played one of the most difficult piano concertos in the classical repertoire, flawlessly 3 nights ago. That was different, Minji said. I didn't know anyone was listening. Interesting distinction, Professor Park murmured. Dean Wong leaned forward. Minji, why did you apply to the conservatory if you don't want to perform? I didn't, Minji admitted. My high school teacher submitted the application. He recorded me playing when I didn't know he was there. I only found out when the acceptance letter came. The dean raised her eyebrows. And you came anyway? Minji nodded. My parents were so proud. And I do love music. I thought maybe I could focus on composition, or teaching, or something that doesn't require performing. Professor Kang shook his head. That's not how our program works. Performance is a core requirement for all students, regardless of specialization. I know, Minji said. I was trying to just get by. Play well enough to pass, but not well enough to be noticed. Professor Kang finished for her. His voice wasn't unkind, but it was firm. That ends now. Minji looked up, meeting his eyes for the first time. What do you mean? Professor Kang exchanged glances with his colleagues before continuing. The conservatory holds a showcase every semester. The finest students are selected to perform for distinguished guests, potential donors, representatives from arts organizations, faculty from other institutions. Minji's stomach twisted. She knew where this was heading. This semester's showcase is in 2 weeks, Professor Kang continued. We want you to perform Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 3. Minji shook her head. I can't. You can, Professor Kang said firmly. We've seen you do it. That was different, Minji repeated, her voice rising slightly. I was alone, or I thought I was. Adjustment of mindset, Professor Kang said, as if it were that simple. We'll work with you. No, Minji said, surprising herself with her own firmness. I'm sorry, but I can't do it. Dean Wong cleared her throat. Miss Park, I should mention that Professor Kang has invited several faculty members from Juilliard to attend this showcase. They're particularly interested in hearing the Rachmaninoff. Minji's eyes widened. Juilliard? Why would they? Because I told them about you, Professor Kang said simply. About what I heard Friday night. You told them about me? Before even speaking to me, I recognized exceptional talent. It's my job to nurture it, and to make sure it's seen and heard. Minji felt panic rising in her chest, making it hard to breathe. I can't perform in front of people. I've tried. It doesn't work. Professor Kang leaned back in his chair. Minji, do you know why I pushed so hard to have you admitted to this conservatory despite your deliberately underwhelming audition tape? Minji blinked in surprise. You what? Your high school teacher didn't submit your application. I did. I don't understand. Professor Kang's expression softened slightly. Mr. Cho was my student many years ago. When he told me about a former student with extraordinary talent who'd stopped performing, I was intrigued. He sent me a recording. You playing Chopin's Ballade No. 1, I believe. Even in that piece, I could hear something special. Something rare. Minji sat in stunned silence. Professor Kang had engineered her admission? Had known about her all along? Your scholarship comes from a special fund I oversee personally, Professor Kang continued. For exceptional students with unique circumstances. The implication hung in the air, unspoken but clear. So if I don't perform, Minji began. We would need to reevaluate your scholarship status, Dean Wong said gently. The conservatory has limited resources. Many talented students who would gladly perform. Minji felt tears welling up. This isn't fair. No, Professor Kang agreed, surprising her. It isn't fair that someone with your gift is paralyzed by fear. It isn't fair that the world is deprived of music played the way you play it. I'm not ready, Minji whispered. You have 2 weeks to become ready, Professor Kang said. Professor Lee and Professor Park have agreed to work with you daily. You'll practice in the concert hall to acclimatize yourself to the space. We'll bring in small groups of students as audience members, gradually increasing the number. Minji shook her head, tears now flowing freely. It won't work. Nothing has worked. I've tried everything. Not everything, Professor Kang said quietly. He stood up and walked to the piano in the corner of his office. Come here, Minji. Reluctantly, she rose and joined him at the piano. Play the opening of the Rachmaninoff, he instructed. Just the first few measures. Minji wiped her tears with the back of her hand and sat down at the bench. Her fingers trembled as she placed them on the keys. She could feel the professors watching her, evaluating her. The familiar paralysis began to creep into her hands. Close your eyes, Professor Kang said. Minji hesitated, then closed her eyes. Now, imagine you're alone, in an empty room with just this piano and the music. Minji took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. She began to play, haltingly at first, then with more confidence as she lost herself in the familiar notes. Open your eyes, but keep playing, Professor Kang said after a moment. Minji opened her eyes, her fingers still moving across the keys. For a few precious seconds, the music continued to flow. Then awareness crashed back, the professors watching, the pressure, the expectations, and her hands stumbled to a stop. Professor Kang nodded as if confirming something to himself. 2 weeks, Miss Park. The showcase is on Friday the 15th at 7 p.m., the Rachmaninoff Concerto. His voice softened slightly. I believe you can do this. More importantly, you need to do this for yourself. Minji stood up from the piano bench, her legs unsteady. And if I can't? Professor Kang didn't answer directly. Instead, he said, sometimes the things we fear most are the very things that will set us free. As Minji left the office, her mind was a storm of emotions. Fear, anger, disbelief. But underneath it all, barely perceptible, was something else, a tiny spark of what might have been hope. The 2 weeks leading up to the showcase passed in a blur for Minji. Each day followed the same grueling pattern. Morning sessions with Professor Lee working on technique, afternoons with Professor Park focusing on expression and interpretation, and evenings with Professor Kang himself, who pushed her relentlessly through every measure of Rachmaninoff's demanding concerto. Again, Professor Kang would say, after she'd played a particularly difficult passage, this time, feel the music, don't just play the notes. Minji would try again, her fingers flying across the keys, sweat beading on her forehead despite the cool air of the practice room. Better, he would grudgingly admit. Now the next section. As promised, they gradually introduced small audiences during her practice sessions. First just a handful of other piano students, then larger groups of mixed instrumentalists. Each time Minji's anxiety would spike, her hands would tremble and she'd miss notes she could play perfectly when alone. Breathe, Professor Lee would remind her. Focus on the music, not the people. Easier said than done. Each time the door opened and another person entered the room, Minji felt her chest tighten a little more, her concentration fracture a little further. After one particularly disastrous session where she'd completely frozen mid-piece with 20 students watching, Minji had locked herself in a bathroom stall and cried until she had no tears left. I can't do this, she'd whispered to herself, over and over. But the next day she was back at the piano. Something kept pulling her forward. Perhaps the way Professor Kang looked at her with unwavering confidence, or how Professor Lee squeezed her shoulder encouragingly after difficult sessions. Or maybe it was the music itself, which had been her closest companion since childhood. The night before the showcase, Minji couldn't sleep. She lay in bed staring at the ceiling, her mind racing with 1,000 what-ifs. What if she froze again? What if she embarrassed herself in front of the entire conservatory and visiting faculty from Juilliard, no less? What if this was the end of her musical education? Minji? Her mother's soft voice came from the doorway. You should sleep. I can't, Minji admitted. Her mother sat on the edge of the bed. In the dim light filtering through the curtains, Minji could see the concern in her eyes. Professor Kang called me today, her mother said. Minji sat up. He did? Why? He wanted to tell me how proud I should be of you. Her mother smiled. He said you've worked harder these past 2 weeks than any student he's ever taught. Minji pulled her knees to her chest. I'm still terrified. Her mother reached out to smooth Minji's hair, a gesture from childhood that still brought comfort. Do you remember what grandmother used to say about fear? Minji nodded. Fear is just excitement without breath. Yes, her mother said. Maybe tomorrow, instead of thinking about all the people watching you, think about grandmother. Play for her. Minji closed her eyes. Her grandmother had been her first piano teacher, guiding her small fingers over the keys of an old upright piano that smelled of polish and time. Grandmother had never pushed or demanded, had only smiled with delight at each new piece Minji mastered. I'll try, Minji whispered. The next evening arrived with brutal swiftness. Minji stood backstage at the conservatory's grand concert hall, peering through a gap in the curtains. The auditorium was packed. Students, faculty, and distinguished guests filled every seat. In the front row, she could see Professor Kang sitting beside several well-dressed visitors who must be the faculty from Juilliard. Minji's heart hammered against her ribs. Her hands were ice cold. She had already thrown up twice in the bathroom, and her legs felt so weak she wondered if they would carry her to the piano when her name was called. You look like you might faint, a voice said behind her. Minji turned to see Jinna, the second-year student she'd met on her first day. I might, Minji admitted. Jinna offered her a bottle of water. Small sips, she advised. Deep breaths. Minji took the water gratefully. I didn't know you'd be here. Are you kidding? Everyone's talking about this. The mysterious first year who's playing Rach 3. Jinna studied her face. You really don't want to be here, do you? Minji shook her head. Then why are you? The question was simple but profound. Why was she here? She could have refused, could have accepted the loss of her scholarship and transferred to a regular university as she'd originally planned. Before she could form an answer, Professor Kang appeared backstage. 5 minutes, Miss Park, he said. Then, noticing her pale face, he gestured for Jinnah to leave them alone. Minji braced herself for another lecture on technique or expression. Instead, Professor Kang surprised her. I had a daughter once, he said quietly. Minji looked up, startled by the personal revelation. Sumin was her name. She played the violin brilliantly even as a child. His eyes took on a faraway look. She died when she was 16. Leukemia. I'm so sorry, Minji whispered. Unsure what else to say, before she died she made me promise something. Professor Kang's voice remained steady, but Minji could see the emotion behind his stern exterior. She made me promise not to let talent go to waste. Not in myself and not in others. He looked directly at Minji. When I heard you playing that night, I heard something that reminded me of her. That rare quality that can't be taught. Pure musicality. Minji stood speechless. This glimpse of Professor Kang's personal pain transformed him in her eyes from a demanding taskmaster to something more human, more complex. Sumin never got to play for a full house, Professor Kang continued. Never experienced the connection between performer and audience that makes live music so powerful. He placed a hand briefly on Minji's shoulder. When you go out there tonight, think of it as playing for her. With that, he turned and walked away, leaving Minji with tears in her eyes and a strange new feeling in her chest, something like resolve. The stage manager approached. You're on in 1 minute. Minji nodded, her mind racing. Play for grandmother, her mother had said. Play for Sumin, Professor Kang had suggested. She closed her eyes thinking of these two people she'd never met. One lost to time, one lost too young, both united by their love of music. And now came the announcement from the stage. Minji Park performing Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 3 in D minor. Applause filled the hall. The stage manager gave her a gentle nudge. Minji's feet carried her forward seemingly of their own accord. The bright lights hit her as she stepped onto the stage. The applause continued as she made her way to the grand piano at center stage. She sat down on the bench, adjusting it slightly, buying herself precious seconds as she fought against the rising panic. The conductor of the small orchestra nodded to her, ready to begin. Minji placed her hands on the keys. Then it happened. The familiar paralysis. Her fingers froze above the keys. Her mind went blank. The opening notes of the concerto, which she had played thousands of times, vanished from her memory. A hush fell over the audience. Minji could feel hundreds of eyes on her. Her breath came in shallow gasps. This was exactly what had happened 8 years ago. The very nightmare she had feared would repeat itself. Just as she was about to stand up and flee the stage, she caught sight of Professor Kang in the front row. He wasn't watching her with disappointment or impatience. Instead, he closed his eyes briefly as if listening to music only he could hear. Something clicked in Minji's mind. She closed her eyes too. Blocked out the audience, the lights, the pressure. Play for those who love music, she told herself. Play for those who can't. She took a deep breath and began. The opening notes of the concerto filled the hall. A simple, almost melancholy melody that gradually built in intensity. Minji kept her eyes closed through the entire first page, letting muscle memory guide her fingers while she focused solely on the sound. When she finally opened her eyes, something miraculous had happened. The audience was still there, the lights still bright, but they no longer seemed threatening. Instead, Minji felt connected to the music in a way that transcended her fear as she reached the first big cadenza, a dazzling solo passage that had given her trouble in rehearsals. Her fingers found each note with perfect precision. The orchestra joined her again, and Minji felt herself riding the wave of sound, no longer fighting against it but flowing with it. Time seemed to both stretch and compress. What felt like mere minutes to Minji was actually the full 40 minutes of the concerto. She played through technical challenges that had once seemed insurmountable, shaped phrases with natural expressiveness, and built the final movement to a triumphant conclusion that left her breathless. As she struck the final chord, there was a moment of complete silence. Then the hall erupted. The audience rose to their feet as one, applause thundering through the concert hall. Minji sat stunned at the piano, her hands still resting on the keys, her heart racing not from fear now but from exhilaration. She had done it. As she stood to take a bow, she caught sight of Professor Kang in the front row. The stern teacher was doing something she had never seen before. He was smiling. The world changed for Minji the morning after her performance. She woke to her phone buzzing continuously with notifications. Messages from classmates she barely knew. Congratulations from relatives who'd heard the news through her parents, and even a few local music blogs that had somehow gotten wind of the piano prodigy's triumphant return. Minji sat up in bed, rubbing sleep from her eyes. Had last night really happened? The memory felt almost dreamlike. The packed concert hall, the initial freeze of terror, and then that magical moment when everything shifted and the music took over. Her mother knocked gently before entering with a cup of tea. "You're awake," she said, smiling. "How do you feel?" Minji considered the question. "Different," she finally said. "Like something that was stuck is finally moving again." Her mother sat on the edge of the bed. "Professor Kang called this morning. He said the faculty from Juilliard want to meet with you today." Minji's stomach fluttered with a new kind of nervousness, not the paralyzing fear of before, but something more akin to excitement. "What time?" 11 o'clock. "At the conservatory." Minji nodded, sipping her tea. "Did he say anything else?" "Just that he's proud of you." Her mother's eyes glistened with tears. "We all are." 2 hours later, Minji sat in the same office where she'd received Professor Kang's ultimatum just 2 weeks earlier. Now the atmosphere couldn't have been more different. Professor Kang wasn't stern but almost relaxed, smiling easily as he introduced the visitors from Juilliard, Professor Chen and Professor Novak. "We were quite moved by your performance last night," Professor Chen said. She was a small woman with an elegant bearing and kind eyes. "Rachmaninoff is challenging for pianists with decades of experience, yet you played it with remarkable maturity." "Thank you," Minji said, still not quite used to accepting compliments about her playing. "Professor Kang tells us you learned the piece entirely on your own," Professor Novak added. He was older, with silver hair and a thoughtful expression. "That's unusual, to say the least." Minji nodded. "I had recordings, and I've always had a good ear." "More than good," Professor Chen said. "Exceptional." Professor Kang cleared his throat. "I believe you have something to discuss with Miss Park?" The Juilliard professors exchanged glances and Professor Chen nodded. "We'd like to offer you a full scholarship to Juilliard beginning next fall," she said, "including living expenses and a stipend for a new instrument." Minji's breath caught. Juilliard, the most prestigious music school in the world. A full scholarship. It was beyond anything she'd ever dreamed of. "This is," she began, struggling to find words. "A tremendous opportunity," Professor Kang finished for her. "One that you've earned." "But I've only just started here," Minji said, looking at Professor Kang. "And after everything you've done?" "This was always the goal," Professor Kang said simply. "To help you find your path." Minji sat back, overwhelmed. Just 3 weeks ago, she'd been doing everything possible to remain invisible, to hide her talent. Now she was being offered a chance that thousands of musicians around the world would give anything for. "May I have some time to think about it?" she asked. "Of course," Professor Chen said. "We understand this is a big decision." After the meeting, Minji found herself walking aimlessly through the conservatory grounds. Students she passed looked at her differently now, with admiration, curiosity, even a touch of envy. Word of the Juilliard offer had somehow already spread. She found a quiet bench beneath a maple tree and sat down, trying to sort through her feelings. The scholarship was an incredible opportunity, but something felt unfinished here. She thought about Professor Kang revealing his personal tragedy, about the other students who might be struggling with their own fears and barriers. That evening, she asked Professor Kang to meet her at a small tea shop near the conservatory. "You've made a decision?" he asked as he sat down across from her. Minji nodded. "I'm going to accept the Juilliard scholarship." Professor Kang nodded, unsurprised. "It's the right choice. But not until next fall," Minji continued. "I want to finish this year here, with you and Professor Lee and Professor Park." A hint of a smile crossed Professor Kang's face. "May I ask why?" "Because I'm not done learning what you have to teach me," Minji said. "And because I have an idea I want your help with." Professor Kang raised an eyebrow. "Go on." I want to start a program for students with performance anxiety, Minji said, the idea becoming clearer as she spoke it aloud. A place where they can learn to work through their fear instead of being paralyzed by it, where they can understand that making mistakes isn't the end of the world. Professor Kang studied her for a long moment. You've come quite a long way in 3 weeks, Minji Park. Because you pushed me, she said, but also because you understood. Not everyone does. In the months that followed, Minji's life transformed in ways she could never have imagined. The video of her performance, which the conservatory had recorded and shared online with her permission, received millions of views. Music critics wrote about the remarkable young pianist who captured the essence of Rachmaninoff. Concert invitations began arriving, first from local venues, then from across the country. With Professor Kang's support and Dean Wang's approval, Minji established the Breakthrough Program at the conservatory, a specialized track for talented students struggling with performance anxiety. What began as informal workshops soon became a structured curriculum, combining psychological techniques, graduated exposure to audiences, and peer support. Jinnah became the program's first official participant, revealing her own struggles with anxiety that had held her back for years. Under Minji's guidance, she gave her first solo recital that spring, playing Debussy with newfound confidence. As the school year progressed, Minji split her time between her own studies, performing and mentoring other students. She still experienced nervousness before performances, but she had learned to channel it into her playing rather than being overwhelmed by it. It's like riding a wave, she explained to a group of students in the program. You can't stop the wave from coming, but you can learn to surf it instead of drowning. The day before Minji was scheduled to leave for Juilliard, Professor Kang invited her to his office one last time. I have something for you, he said, handing her a small wooden box. Inside was a delicate jade pendant in the shape of a music note. It was Sumin's. Professor Kang said quietly, I think she would want you to have it. Minji's eyes filled with tears. I don't know what to say. You don't need to say anything, Professor Kang replied. Just promise me you'll keep playing. Keep sharing your gift. I promise, Minji said, carefully closing the box. 3 years later, Minji sat in her apartment in New York, looking out at the city lights. On her desk lay the itinerary for her first international tour, 12 cities across Europe and Asia over 8 weeks. At 22, she had become one of the most sought-after young pianists in the classical world. Next to the itinerary was a framed photograph from the night of the showcase, Minji at the piano, caught in a moment of pure musical absorption. No trace of fear on her face. She kept it as a reminder of the night everything changed. Her phone rang. It was Professor Kang, calling for their weekly check-in. Are you ready for the tour? He asked after they'd exchanged greetings. Almost, Minji said. Just finishing the program notes for Berlin. And how's the foundation coming along? Minji smiled. The Breakthrough Foundation had grown from her conservatory program into an international nonprofit supporting young musicians with performance anxiety. They now offered scholarships, workshops, and an online community reaching thousands. We just awarded our 10th scholarship, she told him proudly. Sumin would be pleased, Professor Kang said softly. After they hung up, Minji walked to the piano in her living room, a beautiful Steinway that had been a gift from her first major sponsor. On the music stand was Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 3, the piece that had changed her life. She sat down and placed her hands on the keys, feeling the cool ivory beneath her fingertips. No matter how many concert halls she played in, no matter how many accolades she received, this moment, just her and the piano and the music, remained her favorite. Minji began to play, losing herself in the familiar notes. On her wrist, Sumin's jade pendant caught the light, a reminder that sometimes the most beautiful music comes from those who have had to overcome the greatest obstacles to be heard.